Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're exploring the impossible country, how the Netherlands conquered the sea. Imagine, if you will, a place that completely defies the very laws of nature. A country where a full third of the land rests entirely below sea level. I mean, think about that. We're talking about a country where the largest airport, Schiphol, which handles tens of millions of passengers a year, actually sits at the bottom of a former lake, 4 meters underwater. We are looking at a nation of 18 million people thriving on what, by all geographical logic, should literally be the ocean floor. It's a nation that has been in an all-out war with the sea for 1,000 years, and astonishingly, they're actually winning.
There's this old proverb in Europe that goes, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. And honestly, that is only half a joke. Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand how true that quote is, we have to look back at what this land originally was. Thousands of years ago, it wasn't a country. It was just a giant, squishy delta where several major European rivers, including the Rhine, smashed into the North Sea, just a flat, wet, spongy realm of swamps and tides. In fact, when the ancient Romans first reached this area, they wrote about the locals with this mix of pity and absolute bewilderment. They described them as a wretched people living on miserable mud mounds surrounded by water. But over the centuries, those swamp dwellers completely, radically reshaped their own geography.
To understand the extreme stakes of this reshaping, just look at this number, 7 meters. That's almost 23 feet. The lowest point in the Netherlands plunges nearly 7 meters below the waves. The reality here is absolute, and it is totally unforgiving. If the country's massive network of pumps were to suddenly just stop, the land would revert to the sea. The water would return in a matter of days. Everything you see, the lush fields, the bustling cities, the highways, would literally become a seabed.
Act 1. The impossible country. Let's take a step back and look at the very first historical era of survival in this flat, spongy delta. Because for a long time, there were no grand pumps or massive seawalls. Around 2,000 years ago, since they couldn't stop the brutal floods, the locals came up with their first brilliant invention, the turf. If you can't stop the water, you just elevate yourself above it, right? So they built artificial hills. And we're talking about carrying earth basket by basket, load by load, entirely by hand. They raised their homes, their farms, and eventually their towering churches safely above the highest high tides. It's incredible to think that hundreds of these ancient mounds still exist in the country today, with centuries-old buildings proudly sitting right on top of them. Eventually, though, just hiding on top of hills wasn't quite enough, and here's where it gets fascinating. Defending against the water actually forged the Dutch national character. You see, a dike protects everyone behind it. If one single careless farmer lets his section of the wall fail, all of his hardworking neighbors drown too. Because of this shared risk, back in the Middle Ages, they formed what are called water boards. These are literally the oldest democratic institutions in the Netherlands. They are older than the state itself. They elected a dike count to oversee the defenses, collect taxes, and mandate that absolutely everyone help maintain the walls. It created this standing army of local volunteers, and even today, during massive storms, inspectors walk the dikes looking for leaks, doing the exact same job their ancestors did centuries ago. That brings us to Act 2, from defense to offense. About 1,000 years ago, the Dutch decided to stop just surviving the water. They started pushing it back. They went on the offense. This offensive strategy relied on something known as the polder process. A polder is basically just land reclaimed from the water. It's a 3-step process. First, you build a sturdy dike entirely around a lake or a swamp. Second, you pump the water out into a nearby canal. And third, and this is the most important part, you maintain those pumps forever. You literally never stop. And what exactly were those pumps? Windmills. We so often picture windmills gently grinding grain, but in the Netherlands, their primary job was pumping water. They'd line up dozens of them in a row, lifting water step by step out of the deep. That's exactly how they drained the massive Haarlemmermeer Lake in the 19th century, which, by the way, is exactly where Schiphol Airport sits today. You can actually see a majestic working line of these 18th century water pumping windmills at a place called Kinderdijk. But of course, here is where we hit a massive geographical trap. So the crucial point is this vicious cycle. The soil in this region is largely made of peat. When you pump the water out of peat, it dries, it shrinks, and it compresses. And when the peat shrinks, the land physically sinks even lower. So the better the Dutch drained their country, the lower the land dropped below sea level. And naturally, the lower the land dropped, the harder those pumps had to work just to keep it dry. Which brings us right into Act 3, the eternal pumping trap.
By draining the land, the Netherlands essentially turned itself into a gigantic bathtub. But it's a bathtub where the bailing out of water can never, ever take a holiday.
Because the Dutch were so relentlessly obsessed with measuring their relationship to the sea, centuries ago they established the Amsterdam Ordnance Datum, or the NAP. This was their zero reference mark for average sea level. And it was so incredibly accurate and so meticulously maintained that it eventually became the gold standard point of reference for measuring altitudes across much of Europe. I mean, there is a profound irony here, right? A tiny, sinking country made of swamps literally set the geographical coordinate system for an entire continent. Act 4, Catastrophe, and the Delta Plan. Despite centuries of brilliant engineering, the sea eventually delivered a horrific, tragic reminder of who was really in charge. We have to look at the devastating flood of 1953. On the night of February 1st, 1953, a brutal, massive storm collided with a high spring tide in the North Sea. The howling wind pushed the ocean meters higher than normal, and those old dikes, weakened by years of war and underfunding, they simply shattered in the dark. Freezing, violent water surged into sleeping villages. Old brick homes that were never designed to take crashing waves collapsed completely. With telephone lines totally wiped out, amateur radio operators stayed awake for days, desperately transmitting calls for help. A heroic rescue effort kicked off, involving local fishermen, military amphibious vehicles, and the very few helicopters the country had at the time. Tragically, over 1,800 people died, and massive swaths of territory were swallowed by the sea. In the immediate, heartbroken aftermath of this event, the legendary Delta Plan was born. Now, before we look at the sheer scale of the Delta Plan, we really need to bust a major myth. You have probably heard the story of Hans Brinker, right? The brave little boy who saved the country by plugging a leak in a dike with his finger. Well, fun fact, the Dutch had never even heard of that story for centuries. It was entirely invented by an American author in the 19th century. Plus, from an engineering standpoint, a finger is absolutely not going to stop a highly pressurized rushing leak anyway. But during the 1953 flood, there was a real, breathtaking act of heroism that is way cooler. When a vital dike protecting a densely populated region burst open, a local mayor convinced a skipper to do the unthinkable. The captain steered his actual ship directly into the roaring breach. The massive barge wedged perfectly into the gap, completely stopping the water and saving millions of people from flooding. Talk about badass, right? So, this tragedy sparked the Delta Plan, an initiative so massive the American Society of Civil Engineers named it one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. Now, what's really interesting about these marvels is how they blend brute force with ecological sensitivity. First, look at the Oosterscheldekering barrier. Originally, the plan was just to wall off the estuary completely with concrete, but fishermen and ecologists protested because a solid dam would instantly kill the unique tidal ecology in the region's famous oysters. So, what did the Dutch do? They compromised. They spent vastly more money to create a 9-kilometer barrier with massive, movable steel gates. They stay open normally to let the tides flow and preserve nature, but they drop down instantly when a storm approaches. Then, there is the Maeslantkering protecting Rotterdam. You obviously can't put a solid dam across Europe's busiest port, so instead they built 2 floating gates, each roughly the size of a horizontal Eiffel Tower. When a storm surges, automated computers, which completely removes the chance of flawed human judgment, flood the gates so they sink, swing shut, and lock together, perfectly sealing off the city. Because the price of failure is so astronomically high, the Dutch established a mind-bending safety law. The flood defenses protecting their most heavily populated regions are legally mandated to withstand a storm so severe that it is only expected to happen once in 10,000 years. Just take a second and think about that. The last time a 10,000-year event happened, humanity hadn't even invented writing yet. In most of the world, a 100 or maybe a 200-year safety standard is the absolute norm. The Dutch survival strategy isn't about last-minute cinematic heroism. It's about meticulous, boring, heavily funded, and endless prevention. Speaking of engineering feats, here is another massive myth we need to clear up. Amsterdam floats on water like Venice. It absolutely does not. The soft peat and mud there would swallow those heavy brick buildings whole. Instead, Amsterdam rests on millions of wooden and, nowadays, concrete piles driven deep through the mud all the way down into a hard, stable layer of sand. The entire old city is basically propped up on underground stilts. There are over 13,000 massive piles under the royal palace alone. In fact, there's an old local joke that Amsterdam is built on herringbones, simply because the massive wealth required to drive all those piles came from the city's historic dominance in the fish trade. And so, we enter Act 5, Truce with the Sea. For a solid 1,000 years, it was an all-out war. But in recent decades, the Dutch realized they couldn't just keep building taller and taller walls forever. Climate change is raising the ocean, and it's intensifying river floods. So they stopped fighting nature, and they started working with it. But right before they called this truce, they pulled off one last mind-blowing geographical miracle. They literally redrew the map of Europe. They took a massive volatile inland sea called the Zuiderzee, and they closed it off from the ocean with a staggering 32-kilometer dike. It slowly became a calm freshwater lake, but doing this had some absolutely wild consequences. For example, the proud fishing island of Urk was suddenly stranded completely inland, surrounded by farming fields. Even crazier, they pumped out the water to create an entirely new province called Flevoland. Because they were building on the actual ocean floor, construction workers started finding medieval shipwrecks everywhere. Today, Flevoland is the largest dry graveyard of ships in the world. Farmers literally plow their modern wheat fields and boom, they hit a 17th century oak hall. When you see photos of those iconic, endless Dutch tulip fields, just remember, those beautiful flowers are growing on dirt that, a century ago, was the bottom of the ocean. Flevoland is amazing, but their modern strategy is really defined by a painful but incredibly necessary program called Room for the River. To adapt to climate change, instead of just raising dikes higher and higher, they're actually moving them inland. They're deliberately giving swollen rivers the space they need to safely flood without destroying major cities. The government has had to make some really tough calls. We're talking about buying out centuries-old family farms just to intentionally flood historic polders so they can act as giant relief reservoirs. They're even designing futuristic floating neighborhoods. These modern houses are anchored to piles, and when the seasonal water levels rise, the entire neighborhood seamlessly slides up the pillars, almost like a ring sliding up a finger.
And they aren't just working with rivers, they're harnessing the ocean's own power too. Take the sand motor, for example. Instead of constantly using expensive heavy machinery to dump sand on eroding beaches year after year, Dutch engineers built one colossal artificial peninsula of sand just off the coast. Now, the natural ocean currents slowly and elegantly distribute that sand along the beaches all year round. It's an entirely equipment-free, self-sustaining coastal defense system that is literally powered by the very sea they are defending against. It's genius.
So, what started as a desperate fight for survival in a swamp has quietly become one of the most highly sought-after global exports on the planet. As sea levels rise worldwide, everyone is suddenly calling the Dutch. Their top engineers are right now designing storm defenses for New Orleans and New York. They are actively consulting for massive vulnerable delta regions in Bangladesh and Vietnam, and they're advising sinking flooded cities like Jakarta and Venice. The hard-won expertise carved from 1,000 years of struggle is right now helping save coastal cities across the globe.
To sum up this incredible civilization, there is a haunting but ultimately inspiring metaphor the Dutch use to describe their home. They say, the Netherlands is a bicycle. It exists as long as the pedals are turning. The day they stop maintaining the dikes, the day they stop checking the pumps, the day they stop adapting to a rapidly changing climate, the country disappears. It gets wiped right off the map. But for over 1,000 years, they haven't stopped pedaling once.
Which brings us to a crucial thought for our own future. As oceans inevitably rise and storms continue to intensify worldwide, absolutely no coastal civilization is immune. So I leave you with this. What can your city learn from the country that never stops pedaling? Because as we've seen, it's not just about building higher walls. It's about compromise, it's about incredible foresight, and it's about learning to work alongside nature rather than just stubbornly fighting it. I really hope this explainer gave you a whole new appreciation for the impossible country. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep asking the big questions.